What up? What up? Give it a couple minutes or a couple seconds, I should say. Do. It is the second week of January, and the AFC North is, well, it's just Zac Taylor, right? Welcome to A to Z Sports Cincinnati. I'm John Sheeran. This is another live stream for A to Z Sports Cincinnati, streaming on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you get your video content for A to Z Sports. We got it covered. I'm John Sheeran, and I've been doing this for about month and a half now. And let's not waste any time now. Let's get right to the news. Sorry, I think we had some issues with Facebook, unfortunately. But if you're watching on Instagram, if you're watching on TikTok, if you want to get some comments in, leave them in the YouTube comment section. So head on over to youtube.com/A to Z Sports Cincinnati, and I can get to your comments later in the show. But leading off the show, I think we should probably get to the big news of the day, which is Mike Tomlin stepping down as head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers following the 7th consecutive playoff loss that the Pittsburgh Steelers had suffered under Mike Tomlin as head coach. They have not won a playoff game since 2017, the calendar year, I guess the 2016 season and the 16/17 postseason. 7 consecutive playoff losses sounds probably familiar to a lot of Bengals fans because that is how many playoff losses Marvin Lewis incurred as head coach of the Bengals. So now Mike Tomlin and Marvin Lewis shared that title of most consecutive playoff losses in the history of the NFL as a head coach. Obviously, stepping down, Mike Tomlin implies that the Steelers did not fire him. So the Steelers still have ownership over his contract, which means that a potential Sean Payton trade to the Saints can be in play, trade to the Broncos can be in play, trading from the Saints. Tomlin is expected to go into media for about a year, do the whole either Belichick route or the Nick Saban route, and then probably just have his pick of the litter for head coaching vacancies in 2027. Apparently he wants to go someplace more. Can't really blame him. Pittsburgh is cold. But obviously, this leads to the big story on the Bengals side of things, which is, of course, when a head coach gets fired, typically there isn't as much attention that goes to another team keeping its head coach. But with the Cleveland Browns firing Kevin Stefanski, the Baltimore Ravens firing John Harbaugh over the phone, and then Mike Tomlin stepping down after yet another playoff failure for the Steelers, it leaves Zac Taylor on an island. And it leaves the Bengals on an island. And I think it's fair to say that, in a way, this is what the Bengals wanted. This is something that the Bengals probably see as an advantage. I don't know why you would keep Zac Taylor after this year if you didn't think that coaching continuity was an advantage at your disposal. And the entire rest of the division is going forward thinking that their best path forward is to change things up. So when Duke Tobin sits at the podium last week during his press conference and says to the world that we believe that we're a championship caliber team, despite the fact that we're 6-11, saying we as in speaking from Tobin's perspective, they think that staying the course, running it back from a coaching perspective at least, is the right way forward. Naturally, I'm going to think that this is the opportunity. This is the platform that the Bengals asked for, to have the advantage in their eyes of coaching continuity and just organizational continuity, maybe, as something that plays into their advantage. If everyone else in the division is starting from scratch with a first-year head coach, could be a retread, right? You could see in some wacky scenario, like the Ravens hiring Kevin Stefanski. I don't think Harbaugh is going to go to the Browns. And I could see, obviously, the Steelers hiring Brian Flores. But regardless, even if it is a former head coach in a new spot, it's going to be their first year coaching those teams. And typically, outside of the case of, I mean, this year has been kind of crazy, right? Liam Cohen leading the Jags to an AFC South title in his first year. Ben Johnson leading the Bears to a title in his first year in the AFC North. Mike Vrabel leading the Patriots to an AFC title in his first year for the Patriots. Typically doesn't always happen in terms of just one-year turnarounds. Sometimes if the team is in a good spot and all they need is just a change in leadership, that can be what gets them over the hump. But everyone else in the AFC North is changing in hopes of getting the most out of the roster, getting the most out of either, the Ravens obviously have a quarterback. The Browns and the Steelers will be looking for future answers and solutions there. But a lot of competitive teams in the division are now looking for a change there. And again, if you're the Bengals and you decided that keeping Zac Taylor was the correct decision, in my mind, that lends me to believe that this was an opportunity for them, or this is an opportunity for them to prove themselves right. And if they don't succeed, if they don't manage to beat out 3 first-year head coaches in, throughout the rest of the division, which again is a very rare thing to do. It's a very rare thing to see 3/4 of a division completely start from scratch in terms of a new head coach. And the reason why this is even a story, the reason why people reach out to me after Mike Tomlin steps down and says, I can't believe Zac Taylor is the only head coach remaining in the AFC North, is because the perception of Zac Taylor is that he was the worst of the 4 head coaches there. Regardless of the fact that he's 5-2 in the playoffs, regardless of the fact that the Bengals have more playoff wins this decade than the other 3 AFC North teams combined. They see Zac Taylor for more likely than not who he is, right? Kevin Stefanski was a 2-time coach of the year. John Harbaugh and Mike Tomlin both have at least 1 Super Bowl ring. Or they both have 1 exactly. The public doesn't see Zac Taylor as at least an above average head coach. They see him as some sort of an anchor to the Bengals in terms of their success. And there's obviously a lot of nuance that goes into that because in general, the Bengals have a lot of things that anchor them down. A lot of it's self-imposed. And I think I've made it clear that I don't think everything that's wrong with the Bengals is on Zac Taylor's plate. But again, when when there's one head coach remaining after all the dust settles in the head coaching hiring and firing cycle, and the head coach that's left is the coach that everyone would have thought would be the most likely to be fired if this was any other team aside from the Bengals, it becomes a story. I saw my good friend Zim reposted the stream. Zim is someone I've known in this space for almost a decade, and I feel like out of most people, out of basically everyone that I've come close to in the space, he's the one who challenges me the most. And admittedly, I framed this topic on Twitter in somewhat of a negative way. Because again, the perception of who Zac Taylor is lenses us to believe that the Bengals are making a risk or taking a risk in keeping him while the rest of the division is moving on and hoping to do better and to basically rekindle the spark with their teams. A scenario that I think makes a lot of sense or would have made a lot of sense for the Bengals. So if the Bengals do not win in 2026 with the only incumbent head coach left, then I do think that makes losing in 2026, whether that's missing the playoffs or maybe even barely sneaking in as a below average wildcard team. I don't feel like that's the right label for it, but you know what I mean, right? Sneaking into the playoffs and not really being at your best. Anything like that, I think the situation at hand now, it only amplifies how much of a failure that is. And Zim challenged me on this, and he basically said that, hey, the opposite side of the coin is also true. If Zac Taylor does succeed, if the Bengals do succeed, and they win the AFC North as the only team to keep their head coach, then that can be seen as a massive success. It can be seen as a risk that's paid off. And I understand that. I really do. I think that is also a valid way of looking at it. I think the reason why I see it the way that I do is because there is equal, if not more, reasons to move on from Taylor than there is to keep him. But again, this is now a platform for the Bengals to either be proven completely right or completely wrong. And regardless of however you want to view it, there is more pressure on them to win this year. There was already an inordinate amount of pressure on Zac to produce results after not going to the playoffs for 3 consecutive years with the core of your team in Burrow, Chase, and Higgins still there, all playing at their best. And yes, the excuses can be made that when 1 or 2 of them are not on the field, everything changes, of course, right? Even if other teams find a way to win and make the playoffs despite constant injuries, look no further than the 49ers, right? So that's why this year it's only more important for the Bengals to get this right. It's only more important for them to follow through. It's only more important for their plan to succeed. Because if it doesn't, then every other team has a leg up in terms of restarting and resetting their coaching staff. And the Bengals literally have no excuse not to follow through if they fall short in 2026. I do want to have I do want to talk a little bit about Mike Tomlin and the Steelers in general. I know this is not a Steelers stream, but I do have some thoughts on the Steelers and his tenure there and why it came to an end and why it probably lasted longer than it should. And just the general disconnect or maybe misalignment between him and the Steelers. And I don't think there's really a Bengals parallel here. But the Steelers, they kept Mike Tomlin for that long. And I think a lot of Bengals fans appreciated that, especially in the last 5 years when they were consistently a 9 or 10 win team that couldn't do anything in the playoffs because they didn't have a quarterback that anyone took seriously. And despite the fact that more times than not, their defense has been solid, you couldn't rely on them to win the games that mattered at the end because they didn't have a quarterback that they trusted. 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers obviously wasn't enough. Is he 42 now? Whatever. He's up there. And he can't move like he used to. I think that the Steelers kept Tomlin because they knew that he was better than any other head coach that they could bring in. They knew that he himself raised the floor of that team, of that roster, no matter what it looked like, to at least 8 wins, no matter who the quarterback is. And that is a huge compliment about Tomlin as a head coach, regardless of, again, losing 7 consecutive playoff games, including when you had Ben Roethlisberger at the tail end of his prime, is inexcusable, right? But there's always the argument of, oh, you could be worse. You could do worse than Mike Tomlin. Of course you can do worse than Mike Tomlin. Of course you can do worse than the coach who went 19 consecutive seasons without a losing record. Of course you can do worse. I think the problem is the Steelers recognize that Tomlin could always raise the floor. But with that recognition should come another recognition, which is if you were always going to be 8-8 or better, you're not giving yourself a chance to just do nothing and luck into a top quarterback that can actually replace Ben Roethlisberger. And they never made any sort of aggressive move to give Tomlin the true replacement, the true long-term replacement to Ben. Like Marvin Lewis got 2 franchise quarterbacks, technically, with Andy Dalton, and Tomlin inherited Ben, and their only other chance at it was Kenny Pickett, who was the first quarterback taken in a terrible, generationally bad quarterback class. The Steelers not making an aggressive move like the Rams did with Jared Goff, the Houston Texans did with Deshaun Watson, the Kansas City Chiefs did with Patrick Mahomes. I'm only thinking of like late 2010s examples because this is obviously towards the end of Ben Roethlisberger's tenure. But really, like they had opportunities to make an aggressive move at quarterback, knowing that you have a head coach who was always going to be able to raise your floor and could probably survive without 1 or 2 first-round picks that could have been sacrificed to get that quarterback. And I think the Bengals and the rest of the AFC North should be so grateful that they didn't during those last 5 or 6 years of Tomlin's tenure when Ben was declining and then eventually retired. And then they never found a true answer beyond him. And now the Steelers entered this unknown period that they've only been in, I guess, 3 times, because this is going to be their 4th head coach in the history of their franchise, or at least since the NFL was formed in the modern era. And now they might just luck into a quarterback because they could be significantly worse with another head coach instead of Tomlin. This is the scary reality for Pittsburgh, at least in the interim. But that organization has enough stability and enough wise people in the personnel department to put together a good roster once that quarterback is found, or before that quarterback is found. And then the quarterback itself can raise their roster from beyond just 8-8 and 9-8, or whatever the 17 game schedule, whatever. So that's something to think about from a Bengals perspective. It might sting the Steelers for like a year or two, but I mean, they've never really gotten a head coaching hire wrong. So we'll see about that. I also did want to get to Duke Tobin, and please, if you have questions, put them in the YouTube live chat. Again, Facebook is down for whatever reason in terms of the stream. So if you're on TikTok or on Instagram, join the YouTube chat, and I can see your questions and I can answer them at the end. But I did want to get to a reaction, or at least some final thoughts on what Duke Tobin was talking about on Friday during his first ever end of season press conference. We talked a lot last week about what we would want him to say, what we wanted him to address, and I think the end result was more or less what we expected in reality, right? Duke Tobin is trusted to speak for the Bengals organization because they know that he is going to prop up their process, prop up their structure, prop up their way of doing things to the best of his ability in a way that almost makes him look foolish. Not almost. In some cases, makes him look foolish. He literally said on an open mic that if that makes me an idiot, so be it. That's how I feel about the team being championship caliber at 6-11. So what he said didn't really surprise me. I think it still warranted the reactions that it got, because the point of having this fake GM take the stage at the end of the season is to hold him accountable, or to at least press him and see how much accountability that he shows. And the most that you kind of got from that is that, yeah, like, he needs to do better. And he said it himself. He needs to do a better job of being the center of all of these decisions that are made. He said it without saying it out loud, that there is no clear, not direction, there are no clear labels in terms of who is responsible for who and who makes like these final decisions. Everything is the buzzword of the press conference was collaborative effort, or collaborative approach. And they take pride in that. They take pride in the fact that there is no general manager. There is no monarch who has ultimate unilateral authority. If there is one, I mean, he said it's Mike Brown's team at the end of the day, right? If aliens came down to Earth and they asked for the GM of the Bengals, Mike Brown would step forward. It would not be Duke Tobin. And that's what I want everyone around the league to understand, that the Bengals are like the Cowboys and that they don't have a GM. The GM is ultimately the owner. The difference in this case is that the owner or / GM of the Bengals doesn't go on a radio show every single week. Mike Brown is the opposite in terms of how much attention that he wants compared to Jerry Jones. But ultimately, Mike Brown doesn't want a football guy to make all the decisions under him. He would rather have a guy like Duke Tobin, who puts a lot of responsibility on himself to hear and value the opinions and the analysis of his coaching staff, of his personnel department, and of his superiors in the front office, in the ownership family, right? The brass of the team, the Blackburns and the Browns. And everything gets funneled back to him, and he's the guy that has to make these final says in terms of who they're drafting, who they're signing, who they're claiming, all that stuff, right? Even if a GM would have more ownership over negotiating these contracts, which he himself said that it's not entirely him. Sometimes it's Katie Blackburn. Sometimes it's him. We know, not from him saying it, but we know that the important contracts get handled by Katie Blackburn. And she negotiates just as tenacious, if not, you know what word I want to use, just as much as Mike Brown used to do back when he was the guy running everything. It's been Katie for a long time, but they pride themselves on this collaborative approach. And unfortunately, in doing so, it doesn't seem like there is a lot of accountability, because if no one gets pinned as the sole decision maker of why they went a certain direction in the draft or why they went a certain direction in free agency, it's almost like it's everyone's fault, and you can't fire everybody. We still really don't know if Duke Tobin is ever going to be in a position where he himself can be fired. That's all speculation at the end of the day. Him being out there Friday afternoon wasn't like some pressure move made by the front office or the owner's family to put him in the limelight as a way of being like, hey, like, you got to take some accountability for what you did to our team. They didn't do that because, again, it's not just Duke Tobin making these decisions. The best way that I can describe it is organized chaos. And it's a big reason why a lot of the things that they've done in the last 3 years have not worked. But specifically in these last 3 years, hold on. Duke ultimately did the thing that the Bengals typically do, and it's that if they have any semblance of recent success, they're going to pat themselves on the back and say, hey, like, don't be mad at us for being bad right now. Look at what we did X amount of years ago, or look at what we just did, right? It used to be going to the playoffs 5 consecutive years as a reason why they didn't move on from Marvin Lewis, or they didn't make any significant changes from 2016 to 2018, right? Now it's Duke saying to everybody, nobody's happy right now, but we were all happy in Los Angeles when we made the Super Bowl. Didn't specify how that Super Bowl went, but that was the justification as to why things shouldn't change, because this group did it before half a decade ago. I want Duke to remember something, specifically with this instance that he mentioned. The only reason why the biggest reason why the Bengals made that Super Bowl, it goes beyond Joe Burrow. It goes beyond changing head coaches. They do not get that far. They do not get a couple minutes away from hoisting their own Lombardi trophy for the first time if they didn't make a significant change in how they built the team. There are a lot of Bengals fans that weren't here in the Marvin Lewis tenure era, whatever you want to call it. They did absolutely nothing in free agency for the first 25 years of free agency's existence. They did nothing. They did jack squat. They never made their team, their roster better in March. They always counted on draft picks hitting. Not necessarily immediately. They counted on draft picks hitting in a couple years, and then hopefully the team just doesn't have any holes. They never aggressively filled holes in free agency until 2020, when the whole team was so bad and they had so much cap space, they didn't have a choice. And obviously bringing in a new head coach who just came from the Los Angeles Rams of all teams is going to want to spend in free agency. They actually take free agency seriously in 2020 and 2021, and they hit more times than not. And all of a sudden, the roster is as good as it's ever been, with a generational franchise quarterback leading it. It's no wonder they made the Super Bowl that year. Everything hit. But nothing. They do not get that far if they don't take that step. If they don't take that evolution as a franchise to change what they do. If they had just stuck in their ways and avoided free agency like the plague, like they always did in the first 25 years of free agency, they do not make the Super Bowl. And Duke Tobin has nothing to say about this process works because we did it 5 years ago. Again, Joe Burrow obviously is the most valuable player on the team. Jamar Chase obviously added so much value in the draft with the 5th overall pick. But we've seen Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase try to be superheroes the last couple of years when the rest of the team is not good. And obviously, part of that is because they've failed to a certain extent in free agency. They've also failed in the draft as well. And that's why further evolutions are needed. You took that first major step in terms of treating free agency like it's serious, like every other team does. Almost, right? You still don't give out contracts that are competitive in terms of guaranteed money, and you still limit yourself in terms of which players that you can actually attract. But actually going out and get difference makers in free agency was the first step, the first piece of evolution that you needed to make in order to actually become serious. Now you need to continue to evolve. Duke Tobin dismissing any sort of change after the last 3 years is ignoring the fact that change is what got him to the Super Bowl in the first place. Not even winning the Super Bowl, by the way, which is, it felt like another kind of just slap in the face about we were all happy right before we lost the Super Bowl and not taking other steps after losing the Super Bowl. Again, is still showing immense signs of complacency. Continuing to evolve is a must for the Bengals. And for Duke Tobin to dismiss any change outright, nobody was expecting any plans, any specific detailed plans to be laid out for the media to see. Nobody was expecting that. But acknowledging that what you've done over the past 3 years has not worked and different approaches are needed. Recognizing that, not only taking accountability, but promising that notable tweaks in the process will be implemented, acknowledging that stringing out these contract negotiations, because again, your just dire fear of guaranteed money keeps getting in the way of this. Acknowledging that and recognizing the need to do better, that's all I think fans needed. There was never going to be a perfect press conference for him to appease everybody, but recognizing that and promising that would have gone a long way. Instead of just, again, hanging your hat on a Super Bowl appearance from 5 years ago and thinking that you can just do it again by changing nothing. That is what I think bothered people the most. It's certainly what bothered me the most. And it's something that I want Duke to remember. Change is always needed. Getting complacent is the reason why it took you so long to get to a Super Bowl in the first place. Don't be afraid to evolve. I want to get to some comments here, all from YouTube. Again, if you're on TikTok, if you're on Instagram, go over to the YouTube stream if you want to get a question, and we're going to be wrapping up here in about 5 minutes or so. From Misha Cincinnati, couldn't Dan Pitcher be continuity? Do you think the offense got better when Pitch became OC? I think, yes, I do. I think I love the way that Pitch sees the game. I think he's arguably the smartest coach on staff. And I think his involvement in terms of making Joe and Jake's and the other Joe's lives easier at quarterback, and his involvement, his influence, and just revolutionizing their under center game, I think conjoined also with Scott Peters and his teachings in terms of making wide zone work for their offensive line. All of that is kind of factored into the offense taking those steps that it needed to take. And I do think that the Bengals would be worse off if they lost Dan Pitcher to the Cleveland Browns. Dan Pitcher, if you don't know, interviewed for the head coaching gig for the Cleveland Browns last week, but the Browns are interviewing a ton of candidates and nothing is finalized there at all. But according to ESPN's Jeremy Fowler, Pitch does have a lot of fans already in the building in Cleveland before he interviewed. And that makes sense, right? Like, Pitch has been with the Bengals since 2016. The Browns are obviously very intimately familiar with the Bengals and the way that they do things. So they've kind of watched his career kind of rise with the Bengals. He started off as like an assistant wide receivers coach, an assistant quarterbacks coach. Then he was Joe Burrow's first quarterbacks coach. And now he's been the offense coordinator for the last 2 years. I don't think it's unfair, I think, for people to say like, oh, the Bengals or like a team would be stupid to hire another Bengals offense coordinator. I think Dan Pitcher is a completely different person than Brian Callahan. And I think that his influence in the offense has been immense, and losing him would be, it wouldn't be great. Let's see here. Nisco Bisco, all these coaches that you mentioned with success in the first year have a team with a franchise quarterback. The Ravens will rebound with a new head coach. And I think that's why like the Ravens were justified in moving on from a guy like Harbaugh, who I think people really attach themselves to a coach with, the record that he had with that organization. And I think the Ravens are a type of organization that can afford to move on from a John Harbaugh, not just move on, but rebound really quickly, like you said. I think that, like the Eagles, when they realize that something is not right, they don't waste as much time to remedy that, or to at least try to remedy that. That's why the Eagles are moving on from like their seventh offensive coordinator or like fifth offensive coordinator in 5 years. Jalen Hurts has no offensive coordinator, play caller continuity. But yeah, like the Ravens are set up at least organizationally to rebound as quickly as possible, and I think they'll probably get a good hire as well. Zoomed in really far. This is an interesting one. Cincy fan, Jungle City 9871. I'm upset that Burrow wants to keep Zac Taylor, but stands up there and demands changes as pressers. This is an interesting topic because I think Joe has every reason to support Zac, because Zac has never once thrown Joe under the bus. Zac doesn't really do that in general. Like, I think the only time he did it was when Chase Brown, like, chastised the defense for blowing it against the Bears. Zac does his best to uplift everybody in that locker room because he knows it's in his best interest to be on the player's side at all times. Because once he loses the locker room, like, he's toast. So obviously, Joe's relationship with Zac is great because Zac has completely shaped the offense around what Burrow wants to do. And I think Burrow in general has reason to defend the Bengals in the way that they do things because, they obviously signed his receivers and they paid him. And again, they empowered him like a franchise quarterback should. I think it's very clear that the changes that Joe wants have nothing really to do with Zac. It has everything to do with how they build a team, how they get the team ready in the offseason in terms of contracts, to make sure that there aren't these unnecessary roadblocks in their way of being as good as possible. He definitely wants the Bengals to operate like any team with a Joe Burrow would, knowing that your time with this kind of quarterback is limited, and just keeping the status quo and hoping that you hit with your process is just not the way to go, right? It feels worse when you have the quarterback in place and you're not taking the steps needed to maximize him. And I think he recognizes that it's not necessarily a coaching issue, at least from his perspective, because from his perspective, the coaches will do anything that Joe says. So it is an interesting dichotomy there, but I think there's reason behind that. It's also a collaborative failure. Imagine a company operating without a true manager and just a CEO. Yeah, I think so many of their problems can be solved with just an outside voice coming in as the GM and taking over contract negotiations, taking over roster construction, actually having an iron fist in terms of what to do in the war room. I think what Duke said in terms of what he needs to be better at is absolutely true. He needs to do a better job of when the chips are down and a decision has to be made. There's all these voices coming in with this collaborative approach, and he needs to do a better job of actually making the right decision. And it would be nice if he wasn't, or if the team wasn't forced to take certain positions in the draft because they don't fill those holes in free agency. Because again, they limit themselves in terms of which players that they can actually target because they don't want to actually guarantee the second years of these contracts. And Duke was asked about that. I appreciate James Rapine for asking about guaranteed future guarantees and contracts. Duke's answer was, "We will do what's necessary." I think I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, "Yeah, we will do what's required in order to get the player." And I don't think that was necessarily confirmation that they're going to start guaranteeing these deals for external free agents. He just says that because he has Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase's contracts to look at in terms of proof that they actually did do it. Even if, again, losing Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase is a completely different animal compared to just attracting an external free agent. If you lose Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase because you're not going to guarantee their contracts, the entire fan base is going to revolt. You're going to shoot yourself in both legs and both arms and in the chest and in the brain if you lose both those guys over a contract. They didn't have a choice with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. They have a choice with these free agents. And the time of enticing them with second-year roster bonuses and inflated year-one salaries, that time is basically past. It worked 5 years ago, but I don't think it's going to work as well as they expected to in the year 2026. Yeah, Della Routh, the run doesn't happen without those huge defensive additions, and that's what they're going to try to do again this year. I don't know how successful they're going to be, but again, if the coaching staff isn't going to change, if the philosophies of the organization and the people running the organization isn't going to change, then it has to be the roster. And if the offense is set, aside from right guard Dylan Reisner not being extended yet, but hopefully that happens in early March, it's got to be on defense. You got to find at least 3 or 4 solid starting players, preferably a couple of defensive line, one at safety, maybe one at linebacker, all those guys that would be instant fits in the locker room and could help lead the rest of the young players on defense forward. That is the plan, and we'll see if it works. If you know, with this one, if you know, you know. All right. I think yeah. Oh, one more here. God, I don't want Callahan back as OC. I do think that if Dan Pitcher does leave for the Cleveland job, like I mean, I said it immediately. It makes no sense for Zac Taylor to go out and get an offensive coordinator that he doesn't know when he can just bring back the guy that was his OC for his most successful seasons. Again, Brian Callahan wouldn't call plays in Cincinnati. I think that if the team was really struggling in 2026, which is the year that Zac Taylor is actually going to be on the hot seat because he doesn't have any contract longevity beyond 2027, I think this could be the year where he relinquishes play calling duties, but it's always a death sentence for the head coach when they do that. I think one of the few examples or exceptions was Kevin Stefanski, who did it twice, and only on the second time did it actually cost him his job. So Brian Callahan wouldn't be calling plays for the Bengals if he were to be brought back. But if you're Zac Taylor and you know that you have to win in 2026, and if you lose your offensive coordinator, you're not going to take any sort of risk by bringing in either somebody new or promoting someone who's never been that before. You are going to go with who you trust the most, and who you would trust the most is Brian Callahan. All right, I think we have some issues with Instagram. This has been, unfortunately, it's not going to go out to as many people as we would have liked, but we're going to end it here. But yeah, we went for almost 40 minutes. I appreciate everyone who left comments. Appreciate everyone who tuned in. We'll be back next week, maybe talking about some, I don't know, college football championship. We'll talk about maybe some hires made around the AFC North and maybe previewing some good stuff about the Bengals. How about that? Well, we'll talk about it next week. Thanks, guys.